Welcome to part 2 of my two-part Decadriver review. One thing I forgot to mention in the first part of this video is this belt comes off with a clip, so you don't have to, if it doesn't exactly fit you right, you don't have to keep tying ties every time you want to take it on and off. Clips together right here behind the right side of the belt. Now, on to sounds. Since it is not exactly possible for me to go play Gamba Ride to get the real cards, I had to make my own. 124 sounds are in this belt. 120 combinations, 125 belt combinations are in this belt. There's an extra sound that you can unlock by doing something wrong, which I'm sure you'll hear in this video several times. Now, we're going to start with the Showa era and work our way through to the Decade cards, starting with each Showa rider gets 2 cards. Let's start with Ichigo, Kamen Rider 1. Final Ride seems to be the Showa era equivalent of Final Form, Final Attack Ride. Now, you pull it out, you get that sound. Another one for Ichigo. Yeah, only the Heisei riders get their henshin noises along with their Kamen Rider names. Next up, Nigo, Kamen Rider 2. Next up, what we call V3 is actually pronounced V3. After V3, we get Rider Man. Yeah, the light does light up red, it just doesn't appear well on my camera. Next up is X. Yet you'll notice all the Showa era riders have the same sounds. Amazon. Would have been nice if they put in all the sound effects for every rider, but that's just impractical and would have made this thing cost 10 times as much. As you can see, as you can hear, that's Kamen Rider Stronger, not Amazon anymore. Because like I said, each Showa rider gets 2 cards each. Which, aside from actual seasons of their show, There were several movies for other riders, so there's 15 Showa riders. Making 30 Showa era cards. Next up is my favorite rider of the Showa era my favorite looking rider, that is. There you go. There's the 125th sound. It's a negating sound. You haven't done something right. There are several ways you can get that sound. Shoving the card in too fast. Putting the card in too slow, or a card that isn't a rider card. That is Zekros. I believe that is a movie rider. You can get the negating sound, putting it in too fast, not putting it in fast enough, like that. Now, you can remove the card from the side if you want to pretend you're Ryuki or Dragon Knight. But if you try to put the card back in that way, you automatically get the negating sound. That is Kamen Rider Black, the second to last season rider of the Showa era. Next up is Black RX. Now, you can use regular pieces of paper, printer paper, on an index card. Just cut them out the right way. All you really need is this barcode down here. This thing only scans barcodes. It doesn't scan the whole card. Get the barcode and you have the whole card. Which is what we got here in the 90s as Masked Rider. Next up is a rider that was a bit of a darker rider. Shin was a movie made in the 1990s between 89 and 2000 when there were no Kamen Rider shows. It was a bit of a darker Kamen Rider made for fans that grew up with the original series. And before I go any further, I'd like to thank TJOmega for teaching me these things during most of his videos. I'm not stealing from you, TJ, I'm just repeating your information. Now here's the final Showa era rider. Oh, of course it does this to me. I'm on camera. Oh, that's why. Of course, I have to make a dork move and put the card in upside down. That's it for the Showa Riders. Now, starting with Kuga. The the Heisei Riders each get multiple cards because they were shown most in the series. Starting with Kuga, we get his henshin noise, this turned Kuga into the Goram from his season for Decade to use to attack or use him as a short-range vehicle, or for Momotaro's to swing around at the end of his mace sword Hisetsu attack. Now this one's just a general. Goes straight to a charging up noise. It just says Kuga. I think this one is what turns him into his ultimate form. This is what initiates Kuga in Goram form to attack. This one allows Decade to turn into Kuga. Oops. Sorry. Unfortunately, it only shows a form ride of Kuga. It does not shout out Titan or Dragon, Pegasus, none of that. Now this is Kuga's attack form ride. Now, after Kuga in the journey through the decade, we get Agito. Yeah, I know, Decade didn't go in order through the decade, but I am. Final form ride. This turned Agito, I believe, into a motorcycle hoverboard thing. Now, that echo, you're going to hear that with every final form and final attack rides. Now, this is just a regular attack ride. Final common ride. Form ride to turn Decade into Agito. Now, this card ticks me off a little bit sometimes. course, now it decides to work. This one is just a standard charge-up noise, and then echo. Now, Ryuki and Blade both have 2 extra cards with them. You'll hear them when we get to them. Here's one of them right now. That was an Advent card. Programmed, mapped, this belt is mapped to the voice of the dragon arm thing Yuki had. Final attack ride. Sounds like my belt's having a seizure, doesn't it? Final common ride. Oh, dork move again. Sorry. Another, each Heisei rider also has a standard charge-up noise and then their rider name. Kiva's got a few extra cards too, but we'll get to them when we get to Kiva. Oh. Sometimes if you pull out the card too quick, it'll forget to make that noise. See, if I was Decade, you'd be staring at a Ryuki midsection right now. Next up, Fies. Final attack ride. Too fast. Fies attack ride. Standard charge-up noise. Form ride to turn Decade into Fies. Final form ride to turn Fies into Fies Blaster. And then final common ride. Then we have Blade. Starting with one of Blade's 2 extra cards, Rouse from his season. Blade Attack Ride. Yeah, you're going to hear that generic sound effect a lot. Final Form Ride turns Blade into the Blade. I was a little disappointed to find out that the Reika Daisanto from Shinkenger wasn't in here. This turns Decade into Blade. Yeah, and this light, that will go off after about 5 seconds. Final Common Ride. Come on. Yeah, standard charge up and then the sound. After Blade, we have Hibiki. This Hibiki's card. Henshin. I guess I'm not meant to be a common rider. Final Common Ride. This allows Decade to turn Hibiki bird form into a drum and beat the crap out of something. Next up, Form Ride, turning Decade into Hibiki. Final Form Ride, turning Hibiki into a bird. Well, more one of his disc animals than an actual bird. Standard charge up, then Hibiki. Attack Ride. Then Final Attack Ride. Next we have Kabuto. Another one of my favorites. After Hibiki, most of these riders are my favorites. That was the cast-off noise from the Kibiki, from the Kabuto series. Final form ride turns Kamen Rider Kabuto into the Kabuto Zector. This turns Decade into Kabuto. Actually, I think the final Kamen Ride cards turns them into their ultimate forms. Standard charge up, then Kabuto. Finally, one of my favorite riders. That was the sound of sword form, Momotaros' form of Kamen Ride. Now, Den-O is one of my favorite riders. In fact, he is my favorite rider of the show of between Kuga and Decade. This releases Momotaros from Den-O form so he can fight as an Imagi. Rather, Den-O is my favorite rider programmed into this belt. If Double was in here, he'd be my favorite. Charge up, then Den-O. Final form ride to turn Decade into Den-O. Final attack ride. Final Kamen Ride to turn Den-O into climax form. Now, the last rider before the star of this belt that is the sound of Kiva back the third, changing Wataru into Kiva. That would turn Kiva into Emperor form. Attack ride. That allows Decade in Kiva form to copy Kiva's signature kick. Final attack ride. Charge up noise, then Kiva. Final form ride to turn Kiva into the Kivat Bat Arrow. Here's one of the only special card that Kiva gets. Now this will turn Decade into Kiva. And now the star of the show. Surprisingly, I think he gets about the same amount of cards as the other ones. Final attack ride, Decade. I believe that's the Decade Rider kick. Final form ride. Which I believe was never, well, it was never used on the show because he had the K touch for that. Final common ride. Okay, that's why. 2 final form ride cards with 2 for Decade with with 2 different noises. I'm just going to assume that that's to change him back to Decade when he's in another Kamen Rider form. Now, if I were any good at making skilled cards, that would be a copy of the card that would come with the Ride Booker. Now, that's all for the riders. Now for some interesting cards, extra cards that, as TJOmega said, were left over from the testing process. That one just said Kamen Rider. Now this will be a familiar sounding card if you've seen the Cho Den-O episode Yellow. This card was used by didnt to summon all of the movie riders. G4, Ryuga, Orga, Glaive, Kabuki, Kokusas, Arc, and Skull. This was used with the Jumbo Decadriver by didnt. It's also one of my favorite cards in the programmed in here. Here is a very special card because all it plays is, well, you'll see. Sounded like my belt had another seizure, didn't it? This is just a test of the attack ride sound. A lot of these cards here are just tests of the sounds. Which is surprising because there's not very many Kamen Rider cards where it says Kamen Rider card. This is a test of all the Heisei final Kamen Rides. The shortest sound effect in this belt test of the final attack ride. Now these this is just a generic test of the two generic sound effects. Now the last 3 cards that I have are 3 of my favorites. That, my friends, was a test of all the Showa-era Kamen Riders from Ichigo to J. Now, this is a very similar, but yet different card. That was a test of all the Heisei Kamen Rider names. Now this one is my second favorite, the first one being Final Kamen Attack Form Ride. You'll see why. Stays lit up for a while and then goes dark. That was all 124 sound effects plus an extra one for when you did something wrong with the belt. I hope you enjoyed this review, and I hope to be doing more, but not Kamen Rider. See you then.